My parents called it Adventure Days, but it was breaking and entering. I exposed years of burglary, child endangerment, and watched their arrest. When people ask about my childhood, I never know what to say. How do you explain that your happiest memories are inextricably tied to criminal activity you didn't know was criminal? That the father who taught you to ride a bike and checked for monsters under your bed was simultaneously training you to be an accomplice to burglary? That your entire sense of normal was built on a foundation of lies and theft? Growing up, I genuinely believed my family was special, not in a troubling way, but in an exciting, adventurous way that made me feel like the protagonist of my own story. Every few weeks, sometimes more frequently, Dad would wake my younger brother Finn and me before dawn on Saturday mornings. His voice would be vibrating with barely contained enthusiasm as he announced, "Adventure Day, kids. Time to explore something amazing." We'd scramble out of bed, adrenaline already flooding our systems despite the early hour, while Mom moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing thermoses of hot chocolate and packing sandwiches, fruit, and cookies into a cooler. We'd pile into our aging blue minivan, a vehicle Mom had affectionately nicknamed the Mystery Machine after the iconic Scooby-Doo cartoon we all loved, and embark on drives that sometimes lasted 2 or 3 hours, venturing far beyond our comfortable suburban neighborhood into completely unfamiliar territory. Dad would tune the radio to classic rock stations, and we'd sing along enthusiastically to songs from the 70s and 80s, watching through the windows as our familiar surroundings gradually transformed into industrial zones, deteriorating small towns, or isolated rural landscapes dotted with abandoned structures. The anticipation during those drives was almost unbearable in the best possible way. We never had advanced knowledge of our specific destination or what discoveries awaited us when we arrived. Dad would drop cryptic hints. "This one's got amazing architecture," or "wait until you see what they left behind." But he kept the details mysterious, building excitement with every mile we traveled further from home. The destinations themselves followed a consistent pattern, though I didn't recognize it as a pattern at the time. Abandoned buildings, derelict factories with shattered windows and oxidized machinery standing like industrial sculptures frozen in time. Shuttered hospitals with institutional paint peeling from walls in long strips and corridors that echoed with profound emptiness. Construction projects that had been initiated with apparent ambition, then mysteriously abandoned mid-completion. Skeletal structures reaching toward the sky. Warehouses vast enough to echo our footsteps, appearing untouched by human presence for decades, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had built. Through my child's perspective, these places possessed an almost magical quality. They were time capsules from forgotten eras, windows into past lives and past industries, playgrounds constructed from discarded history and neglected architecture. I felt like an archaeologist, a detective, a time traveler all at once. Every room held potential discoveries. Old equipment whose purpose I could only guess at, personal items left behind that told stories about the people who'd once occupied these spaces, architectural details that spoke of craftsmanship from different eras. Dad approached these expeditions with methodical, almost military-level preparation that I admired without questioning. He'd pack identical compact backpacks for Finn and me, each containing a high-quality flashlight with extra batteries, sturdy work gloves to protect our hands, bottles of water, granola bars and trail mix, and a compact first aid kit with bandages, antiseptic wipes, and pain relievers. Looking back, the first aid kit should have been a clue that these adventures carried real danger, but at the time it just seemed like responsible planning. The approach to each location followed a consistent protocol. Dad would park our van several blocks distant from our actual destination, sometimes even farther if the building was in a more populated area. We'd proceed on foot, typically navigating through overgrown pathways where weeds grew waist-high, or squeezing through gaps in deteriorating chain-link fences, their metal edges rusted and bent from previous visitors, or simply from decades of neglect. At the time, I interpreted this caution as simply part of the adventure. The careful planning, the discretion, the way we'd survey the perimeter before entering, checking for signs of other people or active security. Dad had specific rules we followed religiously. Move quietly at all times, but especially inside structures. Test every floorboard before committing your full weight. Rotted wood could give way unexpectedly. Stay together unless Dad explicitly said it was safe to split up. Never shine flashlights toward windows where the light might be visible from outside. If we encountered other people, use the code word banana and evacuate immediately through our predetermined exit route. These rules felt like spy tradecraft, like we were part of some clandestine organization with secret protocols. Once inside these structures, Dad transformed into an enthusiastic educator and tour guide, And this was the part I loved most. He'd identify architectural details with obvious passion, explaining the purpose of various structural elements: corbels, buttresses, load-bearing walls, decorative moldings. He'd discuss the construction materials characteristic of different historical periods, how you could date a building by the type of bricks used, the width of floorboards, the style of window frames. He'd describe the historical significance of industrial equipment we'd encounter, explaining manufacturing processes from eras before automation, showing us how massive machines once operated. He taught us practical skills too, how to move silently, rolling your foot from heel to toe, avoiding loose debris. How to observe where we placed our feet in dim lighting, watching for holes in floors, unstable surfaces, hidden hazards. How to test structural stability, pushing gently on railings before gripping them, tapping on floors before walking across them. He made us feel competent and capable, like we were learning valuable survival skills that other kids our age couldn't possibly possess. Mom documented everything with her camera, taking hundreds of photos of architectural details, industrial equipment, and the three of us exploring together. But we maintained strict, non-negotiable prohibitions against posting any photographs on social media platforms. At the time, Dad framed this restriction as respecting these locations' privacy, preserving their mysterious quality, avoiding attracting other explorers who might damage these special places. It seemed like a reasonable, even admirable policy. I never questioned why we needed to keep our adventures so completely secret. The souvenir protocol seemed equally innocuous. Each of us could claim one small object per adventure, but exclusively items already broken or obviously abandoned, nothing functional, nothing valuable, nothing that looked like it might belong to someone. Finn took this tradition seriously, developing an extensive and carefully curated collection over the years. A corroded gear from an obsolete factory, its teeth worn smooth from decades of use, a fragment of decorative tile from an abandoned hotel's lobby, its glazed surface still showing a partial floral pattern in faded blues and greens, a damaged door handle sculpted to resemble a lion's head, one ear broken off but the details still remarkable, a piece of stained glass from a shuttered church, no bigger than my palm, that cast colored light when held to the sun. Mom would help him arrange these artifacts in shadow boxes that we'd mount on his bedroom walls. He'd organize them thematically, industrial pieces together, architectural elements grouped separately, natural objects like interesting rocks or dried flowers in their own section. Visitors to our house would comment admiringly on his distinctive collection, calling it creative and unique. Finn would beam with pride, though he could never tell them where the items originated. That secrecy was integral to our family's special bond, our shared adventures that set us apart from ordinary families. I wasn't particularly invested in collecting physical objects the way Finn was. My room remained relatively undecorated compared to his museum-like displays. But I was absolutely captivated by the exploration itself, by the experience of being in these spaces. There was something profoundly thrilling about occupying rooms where we technically shouldn't be, about seeing spaces that had been left exactly as they were abandoned, sometimes decades earlier, frozen in time like a photograph. I'd imagine the lives of the people who'd once worked in these factories, been treated in these hospitals, lived in these homes. I felt like a time traveler with a direct connection to the past, touching surfaces untouched for years, reading graffiti and messages left by previous visitors, piecing together narratives from the detritus of abandoned existences. I'd spend hours after each adventure writing in my journal about what we'd seen, drawing sketches of interesting architectural details, creating stories about the people who'd once inhabited these spaces. Why had this factory closed? Where had all the workers gone? Why had this hospital been abandoned when it looked like it had been state-of-the-art once? What tragedies or economic shifts had led to these places being left behind? Dad encouraged this intellectual curiosity, often providing historical context about economic changes, industry shifts, urban decay patterns that led to abandonment. Looking back now with adult eyes and painful hindsight, there were numerous warning signs that should have prompted questions, red flags that should have made me wonder if something wasn't quite right. The way Dad would periodically disappear for 20 or 30 minutes during our explorations, instructing us to stay in a specific room or area, telling us he was checking if other sections were safe, or scouting the upper floors. The occasions he'd return with his backpack, noticeably fuller or heavier than when he'd left, the contents shifting when he moved. The fact that our family's lifestyle, Vacations to Disney World and beach resorts, my expensive dance lessons, and Finn's private soccer league, Mom's nice car and Dad's electronic gadgets seemed disproportionately lavish compared to what Dad's accounting position and Mom's part-time volunteer work should reasonably afford. But children don't think critically about these things. They lack the comparative framework to question their circumstances. They accept the reality presented to them by the adults they trust implicitly. If your parents tell you something is normal, you believe it's normal. If they tell you an activity is fine, you accept that it's fine. Critical thinking requires experience and perspective that children simply don't possess. At school, I'd occasionally reference our adventures in casual conversation, though I was always meticulous about avoiding revealing specific locations. That was among Dad's cardinal, absolutely non-negotiable rules. I remember bragging to my fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, about how we'd explored an old hospital and found a room still filled with vintage medical equipment, metal examination tables, wheeled gurneys, even some old X-ray machines. She gave me this peculiar expression, a combination of concern and confusion, her eyebrows drawing together, her smile becoming uncertain. But then she moved on to another topic, calling on another student. I thought maybe she was just impressed by our family's adventurous character, our willingness to do educational activities together. It never occurred to me that she might have been worried, that she might have been wondering if she should report what I'd described to authorities. Everything changed completely when I was 14 years old. My best friend Maria's father was a police officer named Officer Rodriguez, and he was often present during my visits to their house, a friendly presence who'd ask us about school and make terrible dad jokes that Maria would groan at one Saturday afternoon. Maria and I were in her kitchen making sandwiches and discussing our weekend plans when I mentioned in deliberately vague terms that adhered to Dad's rules, that my family might go exploring the next day. Officer Rodriguez, who'd been reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, looked up with interest. He asked friendly questions that seemed casual at first. What kind of exploring? Where did we typically go? How did we find these places? Were they parks or nature trails? I explained, still being careful to avoid specifics, that we searched for abandoned buildings, old factories, closed hospitals, that sort of thing, and investigated them, learning about architecture and history. It was educational, I emphasized. Dad taught us all about different construction eras and industrial processes. The change in Officer Rodriguez's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to me now in memory, though I didn't fully register it at the time. His friendly curiosity shifted into something more serious, more professional and investigative. He set down his newspaper, giving me his complete attention in a way that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate why. "Do you have permission to enter these buildings?" he asked carefully, his tone neutral but his eyes intent. The question confused me. I remember laughing slightly, thinking it was an odd thing to ask. "They're abandoned," I replied, as though that explained everything, as though it was the most obvious answer in the world. Nobody's there. Nobody uses them anymore. Officer Rodriguez exchanged a glance with his wife, Maria's mother, who'd been preparing dinner. He inhaled deeply, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "I need to explain something to you," he said seriously. "What you're describing, entering buildings without permission, that's illegal. It's called trespassing, or if you actually enter the building, it can be breaking and entering. It doesn't matter if the buildings are abandoned or not." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The word illegal didn't compute. Illegal meant bad. Illegal meant wrong. But our adventures were good. They were educational. They were special family bonding time. "But we're not criminals," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "We don't hurt anything. We're just looking around." "I understand that's how it feels," Officer Rodriguez said gently but firmly. "But legally, it's still trespassing. Someone still owns those buildings. A bank, a municipality, a private owner, somebody. Entering without permission is a crime, even if you don't damage anything." My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what he was saying with everything I'd always believed about our adventures. "What about," I started, then hesitated. "What if we don't break anything? We never break anything. We leave everything exactly how we found it. That helps you avoid additional charges like vandalism or destruction of property," he explained, "but it doesn't make the trespassing legal." "And what about those souvenirs you mentioned that you and your brother collect?" My stomach dropped so suddenly I felt physically nauseated. "That's..." I could barely form the words. "That's theft?" "Technically, yes," Officer Rodriguez confirmed, and I could hear sympathy in his voice. "Even in an abandoned building, those items belong to someone. taking them without permission is theft, regardless of whether they seem unwanted or broken. I left Maria's house that day feeling completely disoriented, as though I'd discovered I'd been inhabiting an alternate reality my entire life. Everything I'd understood about our family adventures had been suddenly, violently reframed. We weren't explorers or adventurers or historians. We were trespassers, thieves, criminals. My parents, my normal, boring, rule-following parents who made me wear a helmet to ride my bike and checked my Halloween candy with a flashlight, were criminals. And they'd made me and Finn into criminals too, without us even knowing it. At home, I attempted broaching the subject with Mom, striving desperately to sound casual, to not reveal the complete panic churning inside me. "Hey Mom, so I was wondering about our adventure days. Like, legally speaking, are we actually permitted to enter those buildings?" Mom's entire body tensed visibly. Her hands stopped moving. She'd been chopping vegetables for dinner, the knife frozen mid-cut against a carrot. For a long, uncomfortable moment, she didn't respond at all. Then she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said something dismissive about how those places were abandoned anyway and nobody cared about them, before rapidly, almost frantically changing the subject to something about my upcoming dance recital and whether I needed new shoes. That reaction communicated everything I needed to know. The way she wouldn't meet my eyes, the obvious deflection, the nervous energy in her forced smile. She knew. They both knew. Our adventures weren't innocent family activities conducted in good faith. They were calculated illegal operations that my parents had deliberately normalized, had intentionally made appear wholesome and educational, to conceal their true criminal nature, not just from outsiders, but from their own children. Throughout the following months, I observed our adventure days becoming increasingly infrequent, sometimes with weeks passing between them when previously they'd been nearly weekly. Dad would manufacture excuses that I now recognized as deliberately vague, excessive work, projects with tight deadlines, inclement weather forecasts, Mom not feeling well, the van needing repairs. I concluded they'd somehow realized I knew the truth and were gradually, carefully phasing out the adventures to avoid raising more suspicions. Part of me felt genuine relief. I no longer had to carry the guilty knowledge that we were breaking the law. Another part experienced a strange, complicated sense of loss for something I genuinely loved, even though that love had been based entirely on deception. Then, approximately 3 months after my life-changing conversation with Officer Rodriguez, Dad made an announcement that filled me with dread: a special adventure. A nighttime adventure which was completely unprecedented in all our years of exploring. He discovered an amazing abandoned mansion about 2 hours away, he said with unusual excitement. Something truly special that required darkness to fully appreciate. That would be the crown jewel of all our adventures. Finn was absolutely ecstatic. He'd been begging for a night exploration for years. I was deeply hesitant, my new knowledge making everything feel dangerous and wrong, but I didn't want to be the one spoiling everyone's excitement. Besides, despite everything, a small part of me missed the thrill of our adventures, missed that feeling of discovery and the special bond with my family. The mansion was unlike anything we'd previously explored, and alarm bells started ringing in my head the moment I saw it. Massive, Victorian-style architecture, with elaborate details visible even in darkness. Multiple stories with a tower on one corner. The scale alone was unusual. This wasn't a small abandoned building, this was someone's substantial property. Dad seemed almost manic with excitement, uncharacteristically agitated, his flashlight beam darting around frantically as he pointed out features, actually took photographs with his phone, something he'd explicitly forbidden and rarely done himself, and urged us almost urgently to explore different sections. Something felt fundamentally wrong. The building didn't possess the same atmosphere of complete abandonment as our usual destinations. There were relatively new tools scattered around: power drills, paint cans, drop cloths, fresh sawdust in some rooms, recent tire tracks in the dust, signs of very recent human activity. This wasn't a building abandoned for decades, this was active renovation. In what had obviously once been a magnificent library, floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves lining 2 entire walls despite many of the shelves being empty now, Finn made a discovery that changed everything. Behind a row of books on a lower shelf, pushed far back into the shadows, he found a small wooden box, ornately carved with what looked like flowers and vines. He opened it with excitement, expecting perhaps old letters or photographs like we'd occasionally found. Inside was jewelry. Real, unmistakably valuable jewelry. Gold necklaces and bracelets with obvious weight, rings with gemstones that caught our flashlight beams, diamond earrings, pearl strands. This wasn't the broken costume jewelry or tarnished trinkets we'd occasionally encountered in truly abandoned places. This was someone's valuable personal property, probably worth thousands of dollars. Dad's reaction was immediate, intense, and terrifying in its unfamiliarity. His eyes went wide, pupils dilated. He grabbed the box from Finn's hands almost violently, examining the contents with an expression I'd never witnessed before, something between triumph and greed and hunger. "Put this in your backpack," he told Finn urgently, his voice harsh. "Right now, don't ask questions." "Dad," I said, my voice shaking with fear and the certainty that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. "That's not like taking a broken tile or a rusted sign. That's someone's actual valuable property. We can't—" "Now!" Dad snapped, his tone harsh in a way that shocked me into silence. Throughout all our years of adventures, through all the buildings we'd explored, he'd never spoken to us like that. Never raised his voice. Never sounded angry or desperate. Finn, looking confused and frightened by Dad's uncharacteristic behavior, stuffed the box into his backpack with trembling hands. That's when we heard a car outside. The unmistakable sound of tires on gravel, car doors closing, multiple voices. Dad rushed to a window, peered out carefully, and I watched his face transform from excited greed to pure, absolute terror. His face went white. He grabbed Mom's arm roughly, hissing something I couldn't quite hear. She looked at him, her expression cycling rapidly through confusion to understanding to horror, then grabbed Finn, pulling him urgently toward the back of the house. "What's happening?" I demanded as we rushed down a back staircase, our flashlights bouncing wildly, creating disorienting shadows. "Dad, what's going on? Just move," Dad commanded in a harsh whisper. "Move now." Behind us, I heard the front door open. Multiple voices entered the house, calling out to each other, footsteps echoing. These weren't curious urban explorers moving quietly. These weren't security guards doing a routine check. These were people who belonged here, people who owned this place, people who had every right to be here. And we were intruders. The realization hit me with devastating clarity. This wasn't an abandoned mansion. This was someone's home in the middle of active renovation. We weren't urban explorers discovering forgotten places. We were burglars who'd just been caught stealing jewelry from someone's house. Everything Dad had told me about our adventures, every reassurance, every explanation, all lies. We were nearly at the back door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst when a flashlight beam caught us, blinding and harsh. "Stop right there!" a male voice shouted with authority. I turned to see a man in security guard uniform pointing at us, his face furious. He reached for something on his belt, and there was a loud, sharp bang as he slammed his heavy metal flashlight against the wall, the sound echoing through the empty space. But in that split second before I understood what the sound actually was, every muscle in my body tensed with primal terror. I thought we were being shot at, that we were going to die. Mom screamed, a sound of pure fear. Finn made a strangled, animal sound of terror, and I felt sudden warmth spreading down my legs as my bladder simply released, my body's automatic response to overwhelming fear. At 14 years old, in the most traumatic moment of my life, I'd been so terrified that I'd completely lost control of my own body. I stood there in the dark, in a stranger's house, surrounded by my criminal family, soaked in my own urine, understanding with perfect clarity that my entire childhood had been a lie. Dad immediately pushed me behind him, hands shooting up into the air. "Don't shoot. Please don't shoot. We have children here. Just kids." His voice was high-pitched, panicked, nothing like his usual calm, educational adventure day tone. The security guard was livid, his face red even in the dim light. "Nobody's shooting anybody, but you're going to sit down right there while I call the police. All of you. On the floor. Now." We complied immediately, sitting awkwardly on the dusty floor of what had probably once been an elegant mudroom, our backs against the wall. Mom was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. Finn looked like he might vomit at any moment, his face greenish even in the poor light. Dad kept trying to talk, to explain, to somehow make this not be happening, but the guard cut him off sharply. "Save it for the police," the guard said, radioing for backup, speaking quickly into his radio about intruders, possible burglary. Then he noticed our backpacks, probably seeing the way Finn was clutching his like a lifeline. "What's in those? What did you take from this house?" "Nothing," Dad started to say, but the guard wasn't having it. "Open them, right now, all of them." Finn's hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the zipper of his backpack. When he finally got it open, he pulled out the wooden jewelry box, holding it out like it might explode. The guard's expression went from angry to absolutely furious. Jesus Christ, he said, his voice tight with rage. You brought your kids to rob someone's house? You involved children in this? He got on his radio again, his voice urgent. You better send multiple units. These people were stealing jewelry. High-value items. This is a serious burglary. I sat there on that floor, jeans soaked and cold against my skin, the smell of urine surrounding me like a humiliating cloud, watching my entire family implode, watching the reality I'd known my whole life completely disintegrate. All I could think, over and over like a terrible mantra, was, this had been illegal all along. Every single adventure, every Saturday morning, every souvenir in Finn's shadow boxes, every lesson about architecture and history, all of it, had been cover for criminal activity. We'd been committing crimes my entire childhood, and I'd been too naive, too trusting, too completely indoctrinated to see it. My parents, the people I trusted most in the world, had made me into a criminal without me even knowing it. The police arrived within minutes with what seemed like excessive force at the time, but probably wasn't given the situation. Multiple cars, lights flashing through the windows, officers entering with hands on their weapons. They separated us immediately, taking each family member to different areas of the house for questioning, preventing us from coordinating our stories. I was led back to the library, the scene of our crime, where a female officer with kind eyes sat down across from me on the dusty floor. I need you to tell me everything, she said gently but firmly. Start from the very beginning. How did you end up here tonight? And I did. Words poured out of me like a dam breaking. I told her everything. About the adventure days starting when I was tiny, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Too young to question anything. About the dozens, maybe hundreds of abandoned factories and hospitals and construction sites we'd explored over the years. About the backpacks packed with supplies and the code words and the rule about taking souvenirs. About the shadow boxes in Finn's room, filled with items from countless different locations across multiple counties, maybe even multiple states. About finally learning just a few months earlier that it was all illegal, that we'd been breaking the law my entire childhood. About tonight, and how wrong it had all felt from the start, how I'd known this building wasn't truly abandoned, but had convinced myself I was being paranoid. The officer's expression grew progressively more disturbed as I talked, her initial sympathy hardening into something more like horrified concern. She took extensive notes, asked detailed clarifying questions, requested specific information about locations if I could remember them, which I could, with disturbing clarity. When I finally finished, emotionally exhausted, she looked at me with something that seemed like pity mixed with professional concern. You understand that what your parents did was very serious? She said carefully. They didn't just trespass into empty buildings, they committed multiple burglaries over many years, and they involved you and your brother in these crimes, which is its own separate serious offense. We didn't know, I said desperately, my voice breaking, needing her to believe me. I swear we didn't know it was wrong until recently. We thought they were abandoned, places that nobody wanted, that nobody cared about. I believe you, the officer said, and I could hear she meant it. But your parents knew. They absolutely knew what they were doing was illegal, every time. At the police station, harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of bad coffee and institutional cleaning products. They called my Aunt Patricia to come get me and Finn since our parents were being detained and formally charged. When she arrived around midnight, her hair disheveled from sleep, her face was a mixture of shock and anger and complete confusion. What the hell is going on? She kept asking during the long, silent drive to her house. First me and then Finn separately, but neither of us could adequately explain. How do you explain that your normal, boring, church-going, tax-paying parents had been systematically running a criminal operation disguised as wholesome family bonding time? How do you make someone understand that your entire childhood had been built on theft and lies? At Patricia's house, after we'd both showered, mine lasting nearly 30 minutes as I scrubbed at my skin, trying to wash away the shame and fear and the lingering smell, and changed into pajamas she'd hastily borrowed from neighbors since we had nothing, she sat us down at her kitchen table. Her expression was serious, her voice gentle but firm. Your parents are in serious trouble, she said, looking between us. They're being charged with breaking and entering, attempted burglary, theft, possession of stolen property, and, she paused, seeming to struggle with the next words, and child endangerment. Do you understand what that means? Child endangerment. The words hit me like a physical blow. My parents, the same people who made me wear knee pads and elbow pads and a helmet just to ride my bike in our quiet cul-de-sac, who checked every piece of Halloween candy with a flashlight before letting us eat it, who maintained a detailed family emergency plan for natural disasters with designated meeting places and emergency supplies. Those same parents had legally endangered us, had put us at risk for years, had prioritized their criminal activities over our safety. That night, sleeping in Patricia's guest room that smelled like lavender detergent and felt foreign despite her attempts to make us comfortable, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying memories like a film reel. Dad teaching us to test floorboards before stepping. Mom packing our special adventure backpacks with first aid supplies. Finn's proud face as he showed off his latest souvenir to neighbors. Family picnics. After our explorations, everyone happy and bonded by our shared secret adventures. Every single happy memory now revealed as part of a criminal enterprise that we'd unknowingly participated in for our entire childhoods. The next morning brought news that somehow made everything worse, if that was possible. The jewelry we'd been caught with, the box that had seemed like just another interesting find to Finn, was worth over $50,000. $50,000. The house belonged to a wealthy family who'd been renovating their historic property for 6 months, carefully restoring it. They were pressing charges to the absolute fullest extent of the law. They wanted to make an example of us. Dad was being held on a bond so high there was no possible way we could pay it. Mom was released on her own recognizance, but faced serious charges of her own. The prosecution was arguing she'd been complicit in the criminal enterprise, even if she hadn't physically taken items herself. When Mom finally came to Patricia's house to collect us, she looked like a completely different person, like she'd aged a decade overnight. Her eyes were red and hollow, rimmed with dark circles. Her face was puffy from hours of crying. Her hands shook as she reached for us. She hugged us both with desperate intensity, so tight I genuinely couldn't breathe for a moment, then pulled back and tried to compose herself. "I need you both to listen very carefully," she said, her voice shaking. "What happened last night was a terrible, terrible mistake. But the other adventures, those were different. Those really were abandoned places that nobody cared about. What your father did last night, that house, he made a very bad choice, but it's not representative of—"
I lost complete control. Something inside me just snapped.
I started screaming at her, all the fear and betrayal and rage pouring out. They were all illegal, every single one. You knew it the whole time. I was shoving her, hitting her arms as she tried to calm me down. You made us into criminals. You lied to us our whole lives. Everything was a lie. Patricia had to physically pull me off of her, restraining me as I continued shouting accusations. Finn was frozen, completely shut down, just staring at us both like he didn't recognize either of us. Mom started crying again, saying through sobs that we didn't understand, that it wasn't like that, but I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't hear it. I ran to Patricia's guest room and barricaded the door with a chair, refusing to come out for hours. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The police returned to our house with a search warrant, and I watched from Patricia's car as they carried out box after box of our belongings. Our neighbors stood in yards and driveways watching, whispering, pointing. Everyone knew. Everyone would know forever that our family were criminals. They identified stolen property throughout our entire house. The antique mirror in our hallway that I'd passed every day for years, stolen. The grandfather clock in our dining room that chimed every hour, stolen. The vintage record player Dad had given me for my 14th birthday, which I'd treasured, stolen. Decorative items on shelves, electronics, even some of my childhood toys, all stolen. Our entire house was filled with stolen goods. Our entire life had been funded by theft. My dad went to prison for 5 years. We lost our house, forced to sell it to begin paying restitution that would total over $200,000. We moved into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew and was so small Finn and I had to share a room with just a blanket hung down the middle for privacy. Mom worked multiple jobs just to keep us fed. School became a nightmare. Everyone knew. I became the burglar's daughter, subject to constant whispers, stares, and harassment. Eventually I snapped and got into a physical fight with a girl who called me sticky fingers one too many times. We both got suspended, but I didn't care anymore. What did any of it matter? Now, years later, I'm finishing my psychology degree, trying to understand how families normalize criminal behavior, how children recover from being unwittingly made accomplices to their parents' crimes. Dad was released from prison recently, and we're all navigating this complicated reality where he's trying to rebuild his life and earn back trust that may be impossible to restore. I don't know how this story ends, I don't know if Dad will stay reformed or eventually relapse into his old patterns. I don't know if Finn, who struggled with kleptomania for years after everything happened, will fully overcome the patterns Dad instilled. What I do know is that I'm trying every day to build an ethical life completely separate from my criminal childhood, to reclaim the moral authority my father's actions tried to steal from me. Some days I succeed, some days I pass an abandoned building and feel that old pull, hear Dad's voice pointing out architectural details and potential entry points, and I have to actively remind myself that entering would be wrong. The fact that I need those reminders, that ethical behavior isn't automatic, terrifies me. But I keep trying. One choice at a time, one day at a time, I'm becoming someone separate from the crimes of my childhood. Someone who understands the difference between treasure and theft. Someone who can look at an abandoned building and choose to walk past it. That's where I am now, still healing, still trying, still hoping that the adventure days, as wrong as they were, don't have to define the rest of my life.